Hi everybody. Welcome to part 2 of week 2, the screencast. We're looking at the other major father of constructivism now, Lev Vygotsky, who is known for social constructivism. Interestingly, he was born in the same year as Piaget. However, he was much less well known in the West and in Europe for a very long time for a couple of reasons. First of all, he died at the age of 37 in 1934, whereas Piaget continued to live for many, many years after that. And also, he wrote primarily in Russian, whereas Piaget wrote in French, which was one of the more common Western European languages. But I want to give you a little bit of history of Lev Vygotsky, because he's also known as the psychologist of the Russian Revolution. And in order to understand what was going on with Vygotsky, again, you have to cast yourself back in history. In 1917, the Russian Revolution happened, the Communist Revolution, and today we know communism as a failed system, a system that mostly doesn't work very well. At least it didn't work very well in Russia. But at the time of the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution was very idealistic. They were revolting against one of the most oppressive regimes of nobles, and the Tsar Nicholas, the one they actually revolted against, had tried to enact some reforms, but for many years his family had been highly repressive, and the aristocrats of Russia lived high while the peasants literally starved. So finally, one of the last revolutions in Europe, 1917, the Russian peasants revolted and established the communist state. And Lev Vygotsky at that time was an idealistic young 21-year-old, and he was a teacher, but he also had been very interested in psychology and had written papers about psychology. And they were read by some of the people in charge of the new government, and he was called to Moscow to establish an institute of psychology for the Russian Communist Party. And his job that he was given was to develop a psychology that would be appropriate for the socialist state. In other words, a psychology that embraced and embodied group action and group thinking, because up till that time, most psychology had been very individualistic, as indeed it is today, except for social constructivism. So Vygotsky, in many ways, was similar to Piaget in his emphasis on constructivism, but very different from Piaget in some of his other emphases. And he actually wrote papers and essays denouncing some of Piaget's ideas, but to our knowledge, Piaget never responded to them, possibly because he was unaware of them or because he considered it not worth responding to. Anyway, nobody in the West knew a whole lot about Vygotsky for many years after his death, and in fact Stalin banned the reading of any of his works. But when Stalin fell and Khrushchev came to power, and in the 1970s, 4 people from Harvard sort of rediscovered Vygotsky's works and had them translated out of the Russian and published a book called Mind in Society, which was a compilation of some of his papers. It wasn't really one of the books Vygotsky had originally written. And these 4 people from Harvard are called the Harvard Four. And they, in the book Mind in Society, they wrote a very lengthy preface. And then the middle section is Vygotsky's own writings translated by them. And then the last section is again their explanation of what Vygotsky just said. So if you ever read the book Mind in Society, I strongly recommend you read the middle section first, at least, because what Vygotsky actually says makes a great deal more sense to me, anyway, than what the Harvard Four say about what Vygotsky says. But at any rate, for that reason, even though Vygotsky was born at the same time as Piaget and wrote strictly in the beginning of the 1900s, he is basically, his ideas are some of the newest theories in cognition because they were discovered so much later than his writing, which makes it kind of interesting. Okay, so what are his theories? Well, one of his main ideas is that thought is intimately tied up with language. He wrote a book called Thought and Language, which really contains the heart of his ideas. And his idea is that thought begins as public speech, speech between people, speech usually in the context of accomplishing something or deciding something. And especially for the child, it is speech between an adult, a more knowledgeable other, and the child in the context of a social task or a social event. And so the thought of the child begins in that public interchange, that public speech. Then it becomes private speech. And this is one of the big differences between Vygotsky and Piaget. Piaget called private speech egocentric speech, and he felt it was a sign of immaturity. If you've ever eavesdropped on a small child playing, you notice that they talk to themselves. They say, and you put this here, and you do that. And if you listen carefully, you will hear them, in fact, mimicking some of the things they have heard from adults. Well, Piaget saw this as an immature type of speech. Vygotsky sees it very differently. He sees it as the process of the child internalizing the language and thus the thoughts of the adults around him. And in fact, it's also a self-regulation mechanism. And I like Vygotsky's idea about private speech better, in part because I've noticed that even adults, when they have heavy demands for self-regulation, they use private speech to scaffold their thinking. For example, if you're like me, when you're trying to balance your checkbook or trying to do taxes or any other difficult mathematical thing, you tend to talk out loud. I do anyway. I say, okay, now I need to put this over here and make sure to subtract that. All right, that makes sense. All right, no, there's something wrong there. And I talk to myself during that whole process. My former husband used to say that I talked to myself when I was writing too, which used to drive him crazy. But I use it as a way to organize thoughts, and I think many adults do. Or when you're trying to get ready to leave and you have to remember a number of things, you tell yourself, okay, now I got this, and I got this, and I got this, and typically you do it out loud, privately. So there's private speech, which the child uses to internalize the language and the thoughts, therefore, that have occurred in interactions with adults. So when that speech becomes internalized, it becomes thought. You no longer speak it out loud, it goes on in your head. And of course, the amazing thing about human beings is that the thoughts in our heads recombine and adjust and change until we create new thought and new ideas, which Vygotsky said would then come out in public speech, in language again, to other people. And so the cycle is completed. And that's his idea, both about how children learn, taking from public speech to private speech and then internalizing as thought, but also how knowledge is created, that thought becomes creation in the mind and then comes back out into public speech. So that's Vygotsky's cycle. Some other big ideas from Vygotsky, which you will find in the chapter that you read on him, most of these, is that Vygotsky, unlike the behaviorists, is concerned with higher mental functions. He recognizes that in many ways we react the way animals react. We seek pleasure, we avoid pain, but he's not interested in those types of thoughts, the kind of thing that makes you pull your hand away from a hot stove. What he's interested in is the higher mental functions that are unique to us as human beings, specifically language, and that's his big thing. As I pointed out when I described the cycle, he believes learning happens primarily through social interaction. So Piaget has sort of the image of the little scientist, the child maybe playing with blocks, experimenting with blocks and trying to build a block tower. And, they try to put the blocks on the top of each other, and over it falls over until the child finally figures out that the blocks have to be balanced. And that's how the child learns about center of gravity and weight and lots of other things like that, although the child wouldn't call it center of gravity. Well, Piaget has this picture of the little kid trying to build the block tower. Vygotsky adds to that picture and says, you know what? Little kids don't build block towers by themselves typically. Typically, their parents or Uncle John or somebody has given them those blocks and sits down and says, "Look, Johnny, look what you can do. You can put one block on top of another." And in fact, if you've ever given a child a set of blocks, a young child, typically what happens is the adult builds the tower first and the little kid knocks it down. That's typically the first action little children do with building blocks. So that constantly, while that child is building at first especially, there's constant interaction with a more knowledgeable other who knows how to build the blocks. And later, several weeks from now, when we look at cognitive apprenticeships, we're going to trace that whole pathway of development. Vygotsky also points out that the blocks themselves are a cultural tool created by the child's society specifically for the purpose of building blocks. In other words, the child is not sitting experimenting on their own, separate from society. What's happening is the society has created a tool, a cultural tool for children to build with and to learn about these things with, and then an adult, a more knowledgeable other, obtains this tool for the child, gives it to them, shows them how to use it, and talks to them while they're using it. So it's in the context of this entire social interaction that children actually learn and play with blocks, okay? We just talked about the more knowledgeable other. Uncle John at first scaffolds the child greatly. Now the term scaffolding is one that's very often misunderstood. It is drawn from a metaphor, as in is the whole constructivist metaphor, which we will look at. But it's drawn from the metaphor of the scaffolding that you use when you're on the side of a building and you're building taller than you can reach. A scaffolding, you put up the scaffolding and you stand on it, and that lets you reach higher to either build the wall higher or maybe paint paint the wall or wash a wall that's too tall for you. So scaffolding is something which enables you to reach higher than you normally could. Well, in Vygotsky's ideas, and he never used the term scaffolding, but many people have used that term to explain his ideas. In the Vygotskyan idea of scaffolding, it is something that enables the learner, the child, to cognitively reach higher than he could reach. In other words, the adult, the more knowledgeable other in the interaction, scaffolds the child's actions so that the entire task can be accomplished. And again, this is very different from behaviorism, where the child would be trained to do every little piece of the task and finally putting it all together. In Vygotskyan learning, the child and the adult accomplish the entire task, but at first the adult scaffolds the task highly. And let me give you an example of this. For example, when I was 3 years old, I learned to make brownies for my father. Now, of course, really, as a 3-year-old, I couldn't make brownies. But my mother started to teach me, and what she did is my mother made brownies from a mix, a box. So at first, she would open the box for me, she would get out the big bowl, and I would get to dump the brownie mix into the bowl. And after she had cracked in the eggs and measured and poured in the water, she would let me stir it a couple times before she finished stirring it, put it in the pan, and put it in the oven. And then when the time was up, she took the hot pan out of the oven and let it cool. And when my dad came home, she said, look at the brownies that Nancy and I made for you, even though my part was very, very small. This is a heavily scaffolded type of interaction. But of course, as I got older, the scaffolding reduced. And again, in a few weeks when we look at cognitive apprenticeship, we'll trace that entire process. Now, a very important idea from Vygotsky is the zone of proximal development, otherwise often known as the ZPD. And that goes with this idea of scaffolding, because typically there are things that children can do all by themselves, but then there are many more things they can do with the help of an adult. And that distance between what you can do independently and what you can do with the assistance of an adult is what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. And this is the ideal zone for teaching. So again, for example, when I did my first research, I worked with children in mathematics. And we tested children in math. And when we had a problem, say a subtraction problem for children, often they wouldn't quite be able to remember how to do it. But if you gave them a hint, if you said, well, have you tried borrowing? Have you tried, well, I guess they call it now regrouping, but have you tried borrowing? Or maybe you should start by subtracting the 9 from the 5. Sometimes if you gave them a hint, they would be able to do the rest of the problem. Other children who couldn't do the problems on paper, if you gave them popsicle sticks or some other sort of manipulative, they could do the subtraction problem that they weren't able to do just with pencil and paper. So the hints and the popsicle sticks and the manipulatives, those are all scaffolds that you offer. Sorry, we seem to have switched. I don't know how we got on a different slide. Sorry about that. Anyway, the child who cannot even do the multiplication or the addition problem with sticks or with manipulatives or with your help is not ready to learn multiplication yet. So that is outside of their zone of proximal development. The child who can already do the multiplication problem perfectly without any help, again, does not need to learn multiplication. That's not what you should be teaching them. So it's outside of the zone of proximal development on the other side. But the child who can't quite do the multiplication by themselves, but with a little bit of help can figure out how to do it, some scaffolding, that's the child who is right in the place where you should be teaching them multiplication, because that means multiplication is right in the middle of their zone of proximal development. Okay? So, 2 more ideas from Vygotsky. One is that learning leads development. Again, very different from Piaget. Piaget believed that people had to attain a level of cognitive development before they could learn certain things. So he would say you have to become cognitive operational before you can learn how to sequence things. Whereas Vygotsky says learning leads development by learning, by working with a more knowledgeable other to sequence things, by mom sitting down with their kid and putting things in order and changing the order and talking about order. That's what leads the child to develop into the stage where they can now sequence by themselves. So again, there's a difference here between Vygotsky and Piaget. The final idea that comes out of Vygotsky, which is the most controversial idea, is that human knowledge in general is the result of social construction. And when you read the chapter on social constructivism in your textbook, they will explain that idea further. Radical social constructivism would say that all reality is constructed, that reality doesn't really exist independently, it's all a result of human construction. I don't go quite that far, and that's what your chapter will say too, as an explanation of social constructivism. I do espouse social constructivism. That's probably the theory with which I identify personally the most. But I believe it's not quite as radical as that. And one of your optional articles also presents a slightly different picture of how knowledge is socially constructed. In my mind, our knowledge is socially constructed, but only some of the realities about which we know things are socially constructed. So that, for example, our idea of color is very socially constructed. Each society thinks some colors match other colors. Each society discriminates differently among colors. You've undoubtedly heard the old saying that Eskimos know 32 different words for snow, whereas we only have a couple, because they constructed more differences between different types of snow than we do. Okay, so color, for example, is socially constructed. Language is socially constructed. There is no primordial language that we know of. But I believe some realities are not socially constructed. Stars are not socially constructed. They go on being whatever they are. It doesn't matter what we think of them. Okay? However, our knowledge about stars is definitely socially constructed. We can't apprehend the direct reality of stars. We construct it through our interactions, through our science, and in fact our ideas about stars have changed over the centuries, and no doubt will continue to change. So, and if we ever get to the stars, their reality may end up socially constructed by us. We may affect them. So the whole idea of social construction is very interesting and complex and intricate and kind of fun. Okay, a few more social constructivist ideas are that culture, language, and context and purpose all affect how people construct knowledge, and especially what knowledge they construct. So your language impacts the type of knowledge you construct in your head, because if you don't have a word for something, it's hard to think about it, which is why learning vocabulary is so important to kids. But vocabulary has to be learned in the context of doing real things. Memorized vocabulary is rarely useful at all. So there's your language and your context, and of course your language comes from your culture. And then of course your purposes depend on the language. They determine the language you use, the actions you take, and the type of knowledge that you construct. So all of these things affect your constructions. And there are a number of right constructions. That is, the same materials and ideas and resources can be used in a variety of ways to achieve the same purpose. There is no one right way to write a paper. There is no one right way to read a book. However, there are also wrong constructions, ineffective or harmful constructions. So there are a lot of wrong ways to write papers, ways that don't communicate very well or won't get your paper accepted in a journal. There are even wrong ways to read a book. You can read a book and many people may have different interpretations of that book, but there are some interpretations that are just way off, that are just crazy. Another important thing in social constructivism is that through interactions, a group of people can construct things or ideas that no single member would have done alone. In other words, the knowledge of the whole group becomes more than the sum of its parts. And finally, something that many social constructivist researchers investigate is that power relationships, which are based on position or gender or culture or knowledge or skill or personality or monetary resources, influence group constructions. And you can see this happening every day in politics. In politics, we are constructing not only the ideas in politics, but the actual reality of our nation by passing laws and electing different people. And power relationships impact these constructions enormously, but they also impact constructions just between any two people or in any circumstance. So, how does this all matter for education? Well, it means that learners need lots of opportunities to talk and write and explain and debate and create. Just listening doesn't let you construct things. It also means that ideally learning activities should have a purpose beyond just learning, because the purpose of the activity influences how you learn from it. Collaboration with peers and with older and with younger people, all those things are useful for learning. It means that we should expect learners from different backgrounds, cultures, experiences to construct different types of knowledge from the same instructional situation. Ideally, this would mean that we don't do what we're doing in schools today, where we expect everybody to develop the same knowledge from any sort of teaching. Rarely is there one right answer to most important things. And since all knowledge, if not all reality in my opinion, but in some social constructivists' opinion it would be all reality too, is constructed, then all knowledge is necessarily changing constantly. Therefore, developing the skills to learn is more important than learning any one skill or fact. And this idea is related to another theory called connectivism, which we won't have time to look at, but there is a chapter in your textbook on that if you become interested in it.